In this movie, we're going to take a look at how to introduce simple interactivity via event handling, specifically touch event handling. In the background, I've got a browser window open with the Corona API reference. In particular, we're interested in the touch portion of the reference. I've got an iPhone 4 simulator open and a blank main.lua file. Let's get started. First, I'll code a constant for the screen height and width. So local underscore capital H equals display.content height. Local underscore capital W equals display.content width. Okay, so I like to cache the width and height of the display of the device, and then use these variable references later, especially when positioning content. Now let's create a button. Local btn equals display.newImageRect, because I'm using a retina image. Open and close the parentheses. Now the path images red underscore button dot png, and then the height and width 150. Okay, I'll set the reference point for positioning the button. Button colon set reference point. Open and close parentheses. Display center reference point. And then position it on the screen. Button.x equals half of the width. Button.y equals half of the height. And of course, in width and height, we're talking about the display width and height that we cached in lines 1 and 2. Let's save it and relaunch the simulator. And there's the button. Now let's create some text to overlay on the center of the button. Looks a bit like an easy button, one of those Staples easy buttons. Okay, so local text equals display.new text, open and close. And here we will type the string we want to appear, click state, and then we will position it. Right now we're just going to type 0, 0. We'll position the X and Y in just a moment in a separate line. The font, for now, we'll stick with native.system font. And then the size. The size, I'm going to do something that's a bit of a hack in order to get sharper retina text. That is the intended size times 2. I'm going to leave the math there. Okay, now text.xScale equals 0.5. Text, or I should say txt, dot yscale, dot yscale equals 0.5. Okay, so here's what's happening. Since the iPhone 4 has that point-to-pixel ratio issue that I mentioned in the previous movie, we are going to set the text at a size that would be for normal 1-to-1 point-to-pixel ratio devices, that is non-iPhone 4 devices, at least as of the making of this movie. It's 16. But we're going to multiply it by 2, and then we're going to scale it down by half. This is a hack for us to get sharp text on the iPhone 4, but then also it's portable to other devices. So maybe Corona will have some sort of new retina text constructor in future versions. I don't know, but for now, this works just fine. Okay, let's set the reference point, txt colon set reference point, open and closed, and display center reference point. Now let's position it on the screen. Text.x equals half of the width of the screen. And text.y equals half of the height. Save it. Let's see. Cross your fingers, no errors, and there we go. Okay, so now let's talk about dealing with touch interactivity here. The button object is going to listen for touch events. What that means is that if the button object receives a touch, and here that's going to be defined, at least as we work on the simulator, as a mouse click, but there aren't really clicks on mobile devices, there are touches. So if it receives a touch, it will then fire a function, and we'll define that function. As well, there are different parts of the touch event. There's the touch at its beginning part or phase, so as I press down on the button. If I press down on the button and move, that's the moved phase. And as I release from the button, that's the ended phase. So here's how we add an event listener to listen for touch. Okay, on a new line, btn : add event listener, open and close. Now here, we're going to type a string, touch. Okay, so this is, if we go back to the Corona API docs, this is the touch event here. All right, so touch, comma, and then the method that will fire when the button hears the touch event. So we'll create a new method. We'll call it touch handler. Now, before this line of code, we're going to create a function, touch handler, parentheses E, close parentheses, end. Okay, so this method called touch handler receives data that's actually an object that has all of the touch event data, here represented by the variable E. Some folks like to use the event variable. Truth be told, we could call it hamburger. It really doesn't matter, so long as we know that whatever's between these parentheses represents the touch event. Now, we'll indent txt.text equals e.phase. Okay, so save it. Now what we're saying is that the text of the txt object is going to be equal to the phase. So let's go to the window, relaunch it, and as I start clicking, I move the touch and then end. It's reflecting the different phases. Okay, no problem. What we're going to do is we're going to parse out the phases using some conditional logic. So if, open and close parentheses, then else, if, open and close, then else, open and close, then end. I know that seems odd, but for me, I've got to get the different structures down first and then go into the different conditional structures and start writing the logic. So this is a way to try and avoid some syntax errors. So first, if e.phase double equals began, okay, then do something at the, we'll say during the began phase. Okay, so then the next line here is, well, if it's not the began phase, if e.phase double equals moved, then do something at the, we'll say during the moved phase. And I now see just a really small bad English thing up here. Okay. Then else if e.phase equals ended, then do something during the ended phase. Okay, and we're also going to use in a minute the terminal window, so you'll want to have that handy. Okay, so during the began phase, we can decide to change some text. So we'll say txt.text, so text.text equals began phase. We'll just save it and go to the simulator and relaunch. began phase, but as I move, notice the text doesn't change because I haven't set the text to change within that portion of the logic. And then when I end, same thing. So now we'll just copy this, and on the moved phase, moved, and then ended. Okay, so begin, moved, ended. Very simple. When we're creating buttons or we're creating some sort of perhaps movable widget, we'll want to be very mindful of what phase we're in order to properly code the interactivity. So often I find that if you're creating a simple button, you want to put the meat of the interactivity in the ended phase to make sure that the user has gone through a full cycle of began, potentially moved, and then ended. But sometimes you'll use the began phase to preload some data to use in the ended phase. It depends. And it's difficult to come up with an example that would be typical of all instances or general of all instances even. Now in that last example, we used a separate method called touchHandler to handle the events. We can also define a method on the button object, and there's an advantage to that we'll see here in a minute. So what we'll do is at line 26, button add event listener, we'll actually call button as the handler of the event, and then we'll define a method on button for it to handle its own event. Okay, so before this touch handler, function, then we'll do btn : touch. So in this particular implementation, we're going to use the name of the object, that is the name of the object here that's being called, and as well the name of the event, which is in parentheses, : then name of event. So they have to match. Then E stands for the event, and we're going to copy all of this previous event handling, and no need to type it out again. Go ahead and delete this. Okay, save it, relaunch it, and we see that it still works. Now, one of the reasons we'll do it this way, where the object is handling its own events, is because Lua offers us some flexibility in dynamically adding properties to objects. And so by letting the object handle its own events, we can do the following. So this is the code up here, lines 4 through 6, for defining the object. Well, we can create custom properties. btn.color equals reddish. Now, since the object is handling its own event, we can use the keyword self to refer to the object and any of its properties. So we can say, for instance, during the moved phase, instead of moved phase, txt.text equals self.color. And what that'll do is refer to the button object and its color property. Okay, refresh it. And as we move, reddish, and then ended phase. So that'll be really helpful, especially as we go to program games and we want to store different properties about some enemies, objects, projectiles, weapons, whatever. And each of those objects has properties it can refer to through the self keyword, and that's pretty helpful. The final way to handle events is to create a custom table. So we'll say local, we'll call it touch table equals, and then open and close the brackets. Okay, let's go to line 30, touch table. And really the only difference between this method and the method we just I went through is that touch table being an object, you would swap out button for touch table. But since touch table doesn't represent the button, we can't call self.color because self refers to touch table, which has no properties at all. So this is helpful in cases where you might store information about multiple objects, or perhaps have a state machine that you need to update or you need to affect based on touches. I find I don't use this nearly as much as either a flat out method, as we did in the first implementation, or actually handling it with the object. But to follow this through, we'll get rid of the self.color, and instead we'll do btn.color. So, because remember again, self would refer to the touch table, it doesn't have a color property, we actually have to refer to the button. Save, relaunch, and there you go. So looking at the Corona docs, there's actually a fair amount of interactivity possibilities in addition to touch. There's touch, you can use the accelerometer, you can use geolocation, compass, there's a whole bunch of things. But this will get us started with simple touch. And in future movies, we'll take a look at how to implement multi-touch, which is actually remarkably simple. But as one would expect, because we're using a single touch environment, that is with a mouse, we actually have to test that on the device.